Today on the deep dive, we are stepping across the police tape and into the mind of the criminal. We're focusing specifically on that point where a calculated lie, that perfect alibi, or the really meticulously staged crime scene just completely falls apart.
Right. It falls apart under the unblinking cold reality of forensic science.
It's such a fascinating contrast. On one side, you have this deliberate human deception, and it's often theatrical or arrogant in its logic.
And then on the other, you have this undeniable truth that's locked away in these microscopic details, things the perpetrator, they never even considered. We're looking at the forensic footprint of fatal deception.
Our sources give us a truly deep look at two wildly different yet equally sensational murder cases. In both of them, the perpetrators went to these extraordinary lengths to control the narrative.
Right, whether by staging the scene like some dark ritual or by, manufacturing an accident.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We are going to extract those key forensic nuggets, the aha moments, where the science spoke louder than the criminal's charisma or their carefully constructed stories.
And we really want you, our listener, to walk away with a thorough understanding of exactly how that evidence was collected and processed. We've got two really interesting, contrasting narratives to explore.
First up is the deeply disturbing case of George Russell. He's the Bellevue, Washington serial killer, and he used this elaborate, really unsettling staging to amplify the horror of his crimes.
Yeah, that case required investigators to connect these fragmented clues across multiple jurisdictions. It was a huge undertaking.
And then we're going to pivot completely across the country to the case of Michael Fletcher. He's this polished Michigan lawyer who relied on his professional persona, his legalistic alibi, to frame a premeditated murder as just a tragic accident.
And that case was decided entirely by physics and proximity.
The common thread, though, despite all the differences in their methods, is the killer's arrogance, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's this foundational belief that they are smarter than the process, that they can successfully manipulate the scene or the narrative. We're going to see how forensic specialists like Dr. Dragovich, Terry McAdam, and David Woodford just systematically dismantle those deceptions.
Okay, let's unpack this. And we're starting with this shocking series of murders that just shattered the peace of a very quiet, prosperous suburb in the Pacific Northwest.
So we begin in Bellevue, Washington in 1990. For anyone who knows the area, this is not, a troubled city.
No, not at all. It's just east of Seattle, home to about 100,000 people. It's generally prosperous, remarkably calm.
It was absolutely the last place you would expect to see a string of brutal, sexually motivated, even ritualistic murders unfold.
And yet, in the summer of 1990, that calm was it was utterly destroyed. Our source material details the discovery of the first victim, a 27-year-old woman named Marianne Paulroy.
Right. On Saturday, June 23rd, police get a call from a restaurant employee. He's found a lifeless body behind a dumpster.
And what immediately struck investigators as deeply unsettling was that this was not a simple body dumping, was it?
No. When the detectives arrived, they realized the scene was staged with this almost theatrical flair.
The details of that staging, they really suggest an extreme psychological disturbance, a need for control. Marianne Paulroy was found naked, except for a necklace, and investigators later learned that necklace actually belonged to her roommate.
But the chilling detail, the one that just screamed deliberate arrangement, was the position of her body. Her arms and legs were so carefully positioned, as if she were laid in a coffin.
And then, placed delicately in her hands, like some kind of morbid gift, was a pine cone.
That level of calculated cruelty, of actively arranging the victim after she's dead, it immediately signals to homicide detectives that the killer gets a certain fulfillment, not just from the violence itself, but from the presentation.
It's control taken to its darkest extreme.
Exactly. It indicates either a ritualistic compulsion or, a deliberate attempt to shock and send a very specific message to law enforcement. The medical examiner confirmed she had been strangled, severely abused, and raped.
And what really compounded the difficulty of this initial investigation was that they had no idea who she was.
Right. Detective Marvin Skinn noted that homicide cases usually start with knowing the victim. That gives you family, friends, context. But here, they had no identity, no clothing. It made it almost impossible to appeal to the public or even begin to reconstruct her final hours.
But the forensic groundwork, it was meticulous from the start.
Oh, absolutely. Despite the lack of an ID, the crime scene techs collected everything. biological evidence from the sexual assault, and dozens of these tiny, minute fibers found clinging to her body.
Mm.
They knew those tiny traces were their only leads.
And those traces were put to work immediately. The fibers were sent off to the state police lab.
The initial analysis gave them a very broad clue, but a crucial one. Under the microscope, scientists could really only determine they came from a vehicle's carpet or a floor mat.
Which is a vast field, but it points toward transportation, right? An abduction, maybe, a definite vehicle connection.
And then there was the single black hair. A forensic scientist named Terry McAdam analyzed it, looking really closely at the characteristics that can reveal ancestry, things like pigmentation patterns, the shape of the cross-section, the texture.
And based on that analysis.
The hair was identified as belonging to an African-American male.
Wow. I mean, that sounds like a major breakthrough right off the bat. But our sources say that this early clue was actually, well, it was fraught with uncertainty.
It absolutely was. Because the body was found behind a restaurant dumpster,
Yeah.
Amidst all this trash and debris, investigators couldn't be certain if the hair actually belonged to the killer.
Or if it had just blown onto the scene from the environment.
Exactly. So early on, they had to treat it as possibly relevant, but not definitive. And that really complicated their efforts to build a profile of the suspect.
The actual breakthrough for identification came when the police widened their net. They appealed to the news media, to surrounding law enforcement agencies.
And that worked. A woman in a neighboring city reported her roommate, Marianne Paulroy, missing. She was able to confirm Marianne's identity from the autopsy photos, specifically identifying that distinctive necklace the killer had left on her.
So with an identity, they finally had a profile.
Right. Marianne was described as this hard-working, independent person, a free spirit. She loved dancing, she frequented various clubs, but her roommate was very clear. Marianne was not the type to just spontaneously go home with a stranger.
Which suggests the killer had a really compelling way of gaining trust or isolating his victims. He wasn't relying on just brute force in that initial contact.
And they also learned she had left her purse and her sweater at the bar the night she disappeared, which suggests she left under pressure or duress, maybe thinking she was going to come right back.
So the Paul Roy investigation is still struggling, and then tragedy strikes again less than 2 months later. This forces detectives to confront the possibility that they're dealing with something escalating.
Yes. On August 9th, 1990, police were called to the home of a 36-year-old woman named Carol Beathy.
She was found by her ex-husband, Paul. He'd been called over after their 2 small children frantically reported that their mother was locked in the bedroom and wasn't answering.
When police entered the room, the scene initially looked like a suicide. There was a shotgun lying right next to her body.
But this was just another layer of the staging, wasn't it? A deliberate false flag.
Absolutely. It was an attempt to mislead the police, to get them to close the case quickly. But the police were already highly sensitized. They determined almost immediately it was not self-inflicted.
How could they tell?
The shotgun was unfired. It was purely a prop, just there to suggest suicide. And just like Marianne Paulroy, Carol was naked, and her body was carefully arranged. She had been sexually abused and beaten to death.
And again, similar to the first case, they found evidence of sexual abuse, but no viable biological evidence of rape was secured at the scene.
But they did find multiple black hairs, and relatives confirmed that her heirloom ring was missing.
This is where the tension just really ramps up for the investigation.
Oh, yeah. Detective Dale Food immediately recognized the high-level parallels. Bellevue just didn't have multiple murders, let alone murders where victims were displayed naked and meticulously arranged like this.
The questions become urgent, right? Are these random acts, or is there a pattern? Do the victims know each other? Do they go to the same places?
So police urgently needed to link the cases to justify the resources for a serial killer hunt. And they immediately went to the forensic evidence they had. They compared the black hairs collected from Carol Beathy's scene with that single hair from Marianne Paulroy's scene.
And what was the result?
The state lab confirmed the critical link. The hairs belonged to the exact same individual. This was undeniable proof for the Bellevue police that a suspected serial killer was operating in their community.
That shared forensic identity of the hair bridged the 2 crimes.
It did. Detectives started digging for connections between the victims. Carol worked as a waitress, but they found no direct link between her and Marianne. This suggested the commonality was probably in their social habits, likely the local nightclub scene.
And then the horror escalated yet again. On September 3rd, 1990, just weeks after Carol Beathy, a 3rd victim was found, 24-year-old Randy Levin.
This time, the body was discovered by her landlady in King County, So it was technically outside Bellevue's jurisdiction, but the ritualistic staging and the violence, it continued.
Randy Levin had been severely beaten, and her naked body was suggestively arranged in her bed. And again, an antique ring was missing, echoing the theft from Carol Beatty.
The medical examiner confirmed death by blunt force trauma to the head. And again, though she had been sexually abused, no biological trace was found. It was just further frustrating investigators who relied on those samples for identification.
But what really stands out here is the shocking escalation of violence.
It's horrific. Dr. Dragovich, the medical examiner, detailed the extent of the killer's cruelty. There were 283 tiny puncture wounds covering her body, and some were arranged in a pattern that chillingly resembled a game of tic-tac-toe.
That moves it from symbolic arrangement to outright agonizing torture.
It was actually a paramedic who had the grim distinction of being called to all three scenes who finally connected the geographical dots for the investigators. He said the strange, careful arrangement of all three bodies was just too similar to ignore.
And investigators also confirmed Randy Levine had been at a Bellevue nightclub the night before her murder. That linked all three back to the same hunting ground.
The calculated nature of these murders prompted crime author Jack Olson to study the case. He noted that the specific arrangement of the bodies, the posing, the prop placement, it was highly unusual. He concluded it represented a profound, deep-seated misogyny. The police were rightly terrified that if they didn't catch this guy, the violence and the complexity of the staging would just keep getting worse.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the staging serves multiple functions for a killer like this, doesn't it?
It really does. It's about control. It's about disrespect. It's about projection. The arrangement, the use of props like the pine cone or that unfired shotgun, and especially the prolonged patterned torture in Levin's case, it all demonstrates this calculated effort not just to kill, but to shock the public and assert psychological dominance over the investigation.
And the theft of the rings.
The theft of those specific heirloom rings suggests a growing ritualistic element, a need for trophies that validated the killer's power. It was moving beyond simple sexual assault into really organized predation.
The frustration for the police must have been just immense. They'd connected the crimes forensically with the hair and methodologically with the staging and the missing jewelry, but they still had no name. They had no way to narrow down the thousands of people who might be going to those clubs.
The intense pressure cooker search for a serial killer in Bellevue finally saw a break when a crucial, seemingly routine arrest occurred just days after the murder of Randy Levin.
A man named George Waterfield Russell, 32 years old, was arrested near Levin's home. The officer initially stopped him for just routine traffic violations, but then he saw Russell trying to hide something under his car.
And when the officer confronted him, Russell immediately tried to use his standard tactic. He identified himself as an undercover police officer.
But the officer was suspicious.
Very. He searched the vehicle. Under the car, he found a loaded, stolen weapon. Inside the car were a police scanner, a large knife, and 2 different IDs. So Russell was booked for impersonating an officer and possession of a stolen weapon.
And his criminal profile was extensive.
It was. It included a history of sexual assaults and burglaries, often specifically focused on stealing jewelry, a key detail that connected him directly to the victim's missing items.
But his persona was the real genius behind his ability to operate so freely. He was described as charming, popular, incredibly charismatic in the nightclubs he went to.
He had what one person described as a good routine. He would schmooze the DJ, charm the bartender, and then use that perceived status to draw in young women who would buy him drinks and offer him praise. This explained exactly how he could isolate victims like Paul Roy and Levin without resorting to immediate force.
So detectives immediately focused on Russell, given the jewelry link and where he was arrested.
Right. And he initially cooperated, claiming he knew Marianne Paulroy, he'd seen her at the bar, but he denied any involvement in the murders. When they asked him about his transportation, he said he had borrowed a friend's truck.
Wait, if they suspected him, why would he voluntarily give up a piece of evidence like a truck? Didn't he realize that could be the link?
He was supremely confident in his charm, his ability to compartmentalize, and he probably assumed the truck had been thoroughly cleaned, which, to be fair, it had been. His friend confirmed lending Russell the truck months before, but he vividly recalled that Russell returned it in terrible shape. He noted these large stains on the seats and an appalling smell that forced the friend to hire a deep cleaning service.
That's an investigator's worst nightmare-compromised evidence. If the friend cleaned the vehicle that thoroughly, how did the forensic techs manage to find anything at all?
Well, that's the resilience of forensic science. Despite all that cleaning, technicians found a highly degraded blood spot under the upholstery. Now, it was too degraded for a full DNA analysis, but it did signal that a violent event had occurred in that vehicle.
And crucially, they collected fiber samples from the truck carpet and sent them to Terry McAdam.
Exactly. This brings us right back to those carpet fibers they found on Marianne Paulroy. The fibers from the truck carpet matched the fibers found clinging to her body.
That's huge.
It is, but McAdam, the expert, had to be very careful to clarify the forensic nuance for the court. He stated that they couldn't definitively prove the fibers came from that exact car because, unlike a piece of thread you can match by the broken ends, carpet fibers are mass-produced.
So it's a strong correlation, but not an exact match.
Precisely. But they were certainly similar enough in color, composition, and manufacturing type to support this incredibly strong connection between Russell and Paulroy, especially when you coupled it with his criminal history.
The fiber link supported the connection, but the investigation still needed more.
Right. So the search of Russell's apartment yielded a gym bag filled with notes, names, numbers of women he'd met. And when police interviewed these women, the same story kept coming up. Russell claimed to be an undercover cop.
The irony there is just infuriating.
It is. Detective Food noted that Russell was so eloquent and charismatic that people believed him. And that actually hindered the initial investigation, because people sometimes trusted Russell's charming story more than the police's official inquiries.
But it was his greed for trophies that ultimately brought him down.
It was. One woman came forward to the police and said that Russell had given her an antique ring as an apology for standing her up, a ring she immediately suspected was stolen.
And when she realized Russell was a murder suspect, she panicked.
She did. She panicked and gave the ring to a friend who was traveling to Florida.
And the investigators, through just persistent, old-fashioned police work, followed that trail all the way to Florida.
Yep. The friend, who was short on cash, had pawned the ring in Florida. The investigators tracked down the pawn ticket and recovered the piece of jewelry. They confirmed, beyond any doubt, that it was the heirloom ring stolen from Randy Levin's room.
That was the physical, undeniable link. It connected Russell, his specific method of trophy collection, and the third murder.
It was an incredible piece of detective work. But what really sealed his fate was the emerging science of the early 90s.
We're talking about DNA analysis.
Absolutely. The final, unassailable piece of evidence came when Detective Marvin Skinn decided to leverage DNA. This was a critical and pioneering moment in 1991. It was the very first time DNA evidence was introduced in the King County courts in Washington state.
Which means introducing it wasn't simple. It required meticulous legal preparation, expert testimony, a huge investment of time to make sure the court and the jury would accept it as reliable.
Exactly. That's why this was so pivotal. It wasn't just another piece of evidence, it was a foundational legal precedent being set. And the effort paid off massively. On January 10, 1991, examiners confirmed that George Russell's DNA matched the biological sample secured from Marianne Paulroy at the very first crime scene.
And that linked him conclusively to the sexual assault and the murder. It made all of his claims of innocence, all of his charisma, completely irrelevant.
George Waterfield Russell was convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 28 years. The man described by Jack Olson as one of the most repulsive murderers he had ever seen, yet possessing that smooth, friendly facade, was finally stopped.
It's a perfect example of how the relentless pursuit of microscopic details, a single hair, a car fiber, a DNA sample, can expose even the most elaborate ritualistic deception.
Russell's crimes were characterized by their theatrical staging. It was this loud, shocking performance he put on for the public and the police. His deception was overt. But now, we're going to move across the country to a completely different type of killer. One who also staged his crime, but used a quiet, sophisticated, professional narrative of tragedy and accident instead of ritualistic horror.
Both were attempts to control the scene, but one was flamboyant and the other meticulously restrained.
So our scene shifts dramatically, both geographically and socioeconomically. We are now in Hazel Park, Michigan, a small community north of Detroit. A major scandal erupted there in the summer of 1999. The perpetrator here is Michael Fletcher, a local lawyer known for his professionalism and success.
On a Monday afternoon, August 16th, police received a call that sounded tragically familiar, a man reporting the accidental suicide of his wife.
Michael Fletcher was waiting outside his house when the officers arrived. Inside, they found his 29-year-old pregnant wife, Lean Fletcher, dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. A .45 caliber handgun lay inches from her body.
Given the scene, a lawyer's home, the weapon, the husband's immediate report of an accident, the initial impression was, a terrible self-inflicted wound.
And in Leon's handbag, they even found a greeting card from Michael, expressing his joy about her recent pregnancy, which seemed to undercut any obvious motive for suicide. The tragedy just appeared complete.
Michael Fletcher, being a lawyer, understood the necessity of a solid alibi, a detailed narrative. He provided police with a clear, seemingly plausible story designed to explain every single detail.
Right down to the positioning of the gun. He claimed that earlier that morning, he had dropped off their 3-year-old daughter. He and Leon then went to a shooting range together because he wanted her to learn how to handle a firearm for self-protection.
According to his story, Lean was hesitant but eventually fired a few shots and felt comfortable with the weapon.
And when they returned home, he said he asked her to load the magazine and put the gun in its case by the bed while he went to change for work. He claimed he was in the process of changing when he heard the shot, rushed out, and found her bleeding.
And crucially, he insisted the safety was on when he gave it to her, but he didn't realize a round was still in the chamber. He presented it as this catastrophic, tragic lapse in judgment, not a crime.
But investigators are trained to treat every death as suspicious until proven otherwise. And immediately, a significant source of doubt emerged: Lean's mother.
When questioned, Lean's mother was distraught but very firm. She stated flatly that she never trusted Michael and was convinced her daughter's death was not an accident.
She provided crucial background. 6 months prior, Lean had hired a divorce lawyer because she was deeply unhappy in the marriage. Michael, who was thriving professionally, was reportedly furious about this. The mother suspected his subsequent efforts to repair the marriage were motivated purely by financial self-interest, a desire to avoid potentially ruinous alimony payments.
And here's where it gets really interesting. That suspicion, coming from someone who knew Lean so intimately, it forced the investigation to abandon that default assumption of an accident and scrutinize every single piece of physical evidence for signs of homicide.
And the first piece of physical evidence to challenge Michael's sophisticated story was the weapon itself. The .45 caliber handgun was sent to forensic weapons experts to test its mechanical function. Specifically, could it have misfired or gone off easily in the hands of an inexperienced user like Leon?
So what did those tests show?
They used calibrated trigger weights and determined that a significant amount of force was required to pull the trigger successfully, far more than would be needed for a simple snag or an accidental discharge. The conclusion was definitive. It was highly improbable that the gun had simply misfired or gone off on its own. That directly contradicted the lawyer's narrative of tragedy.
So next, the autopsy became critical. Dr. L.J. Dragovich, a renowned forensic pathologist, was examining the body, specifically looking for indicators that would be consistent with the suicide, which Michael's story required.
And Dr. Dragovich found 2 major points of contradiction that formed the basis of the homicide classification. First, he examined her hands. Despite heavy, visible bloodstains, Dr. Dragovich found no gunshot residue or GSR. And crucially, no fine blood mist or aerosol that's typically found when a weapon is fired in contact with the head.
Can you elaborate on that distinction? Why would the lack of GSR or that fine blood aerosol rule out self-infliction?
Well, when a weapon is fired close to or against the skin, unburnt propellant and particulate matter, the GSR gets deposited. At the same time, the violent impact of the bullet entering the skull causes a fine mist of blood to travel backward, often coating the hand holding the weapon.
So the absence of this fine particulate matter, despite all the obvious bulk blood, suggested her hands weren't near the muzzle when it was fired.
It was a massive red flag. It indicated the gun was likely operated by someone else.
And the second point was even more physically damning, wasn't it? The trajectory.
Exactly. The stippling, or powder burns, indicated the weapon was fired from less than 60 centimeters away. So it was a close-range shot. However, the bullet entered above and slightly behind the right ear. Dr. Dragovich's analysis was based on the physics of human flexibility. He concluded that, based on that specific awkward trajectory, it would have been physically impossible for Lan to hold the gun at the unnatural angle required to inflict that wound on herself.
Even accounting for a long arm.
Right. Human joints simply do not flex and rotate that way to allow for a tight, clean shot at that angle and location.
So the medical evidence conclusively proved it wasn't an accident or a suicide, but investigators still needed to definitively shatter Michael's narrative about their movements that day.
So they went straight to the source. The manager of the shooting range Michael claimed they'd visited that morning. And the manager not only remembered the couple, but he directly contradicted Michael's carefully crafted story.
What did he say?
He said Lan had refused to even touch the weapon, despite Michael's continued urging. She never fired a single shot.
That is massive. It proves Michael lied about the entire foundation of his alibi.
It does, and investigators immediately inferred his intent. He likely took her to the range, intending to force or trick her into getting GSR in her hands before the murder. If he'd succeeded, the post-mortem evidence would align perfectly with his suicide narrative. But the plan failed. Michael, the lawyer, was caught manufacturing evidence.
But despite all this powerful medical and testimonial evidence, the case still struggled initially because there was no apparent financial motive.
That's a key point. Detectives confirmed there was no life insurance. The house was Leanne's property. Her parents would handle the sale. So Michael would not profit financially from her death. This left a serious hole in the traditional motive structure, forcing detectives to look deeper.
And that lack of financial motive forced the investigation to pivot hard into Michael's personal life. They got a search warrant and they found it in his closet. A secret stash of emails, photos, and love letters, evidence of a year-long affair.
And this was no casual fling. His mistress was a respected 32-year-old district court judge. The political and professional stakes for Fletcher, a rising public defender, were suddenly astronomical.
So police interviewed the judge.
They did. She confirmed the relationship, said she'd seen Michael the night before Lynn's death. Michael had painted this picture to her that he and Leanne were estranged, that he only stayed for their daughter. But the crucial detail came out when the judge defined the relationship's boundary. She said her one condition for continuing the affair was that she would end it immediately if she found out he was having sex with his wife.
And here's the core of Michael's deception and his motive. He had never told the judge that Leanne was pregnant.
Detective Thomas Clayman immediately connected the dots. The pregnancy announcement meant the judge, who was also this massive professional asset, promoting his career, getting him lucrative cases, would discover he had violated their fundamental condition. The relationship would end immediately, along with his professional patronage. He had too much to lose to allow that pregnancy to become known to his mistress.
The lie had to be protected at the cost of Leanne's life. And the career boost was substantial. She'd made him public defender in dozens of cases, earning him thousands and elevating his status.
This was not a murder motivated by hate or passion. It was calculated self-preservation of his status and his wealth. But even with a rock-solid motive and the debunking of the accident narrative, they still needed the physical evidence to definitively place Michael at the moment the gun fired.
Because he claimed he was changing clothes that he wasn't even in the room.
Right. Detective Clayman suspected Michael's shirt, which he claimed he was wearing, might hold the answer, even though it looked perfectly clean to the naked eye. So it was sent to forensic scientist David Woodford.
And Woodford's examination process is critical here.
It is. Under standard magnification, the shirt looked clean, but Woodford understood the physics of the scene. He put the shirt under a high-power microscope, and on the cuff of the right arm, he detected these tiny, nebulous spots, minute specks of material.
And these spots were not random dust, right?
Far from it. Woodford confirmed those tiny spots were human blood. But the crucial finding wasn't just the presence of blood, it was the pattern. They matched the specific pattern of high-velocity blood spatter, a mist resulting from the violent, massive force of a bullet striking a head at close range.
Okay, let's take a minute to explain high-velocity spatter, because this is the smoking gun. How is that different from, say, dripping blood?
Well, low-velocity scatter is what happens when blood drips, or when someone's hit with a blunt object, creating larger drops. High-velocity spatter, however, is generated by extreme force, like the sudden recoil and explosion of gases when a firearm is discharged close to the head. It atomizes the blood into a fine mist or aerosol.
And this mist doesn't travel very far, maybe only a foot or two.
Exactly. So the presence of this atomized mist on the cuff of Michael's shirt meant he was within inches of the muzzle when the gun was fired. This physical, microscopic evidence completely contradicted his entire story.
It's conclusive proof of extreme proximity to the event. It placed Michael Fletcher less than 2 feet from Leanne when the bullet struck her head. He was in the room, he pulled the trigger.
The evidence was overwhelming enough for an arrest. Michael's defense team tried to undermine the findings by getting a second autopsy done, but it was too late. The body had already been cleaned and embalmed.
So the second medical examiner found the results inconclusive, which was a small victory for the defense, trying to introduce reasonable doubt.
It was. But Dr. Dragovich's initial definitive findings on the impossible trajectory, combined with David Woodford's microscopic evidence of the blood spatter, were far too powerful for the jury to ignore.
The jury saw the clear narrative. Michael was kind and flattering to Leon for months. He bought the pregnancy card to create the illusion of happiness, and he executed that elaborate charade at the shooting range all to protect his career and prevent the judge from discovering his lie.
Michael Fletcher was convicted of second-degree manslaughter and sentenced to life imprisonment. He staged his crime as an unavoidable accident, yet was undone by the meticulous attention of forensic experts who noticed details. A lack of GSR, an impossible angle, and invisible blood aerosol that the sophisticated killer never dreamed would be analyzed.
So what does this all mean for us? We've looked at two perpetrators, Russell, the theatrical monster who sought public shock, and Fletcher, the calculating professional who sought absolute quiet control of the narrative.
Right, and both used this highly specific, deliberate deception to mask their crimes. Russell with his shocking rituals and props, Fletcher with his professional, legalistic story of tragedy.
But despite the vast difference in their psychological profile and their methods, both were ultimately undone by microscopic, non-human evidence.
In Russell's case, it was that single common hair and the car fibers that narrowed the search, followed by that pioneering work to introduce DNA analysis in 1991, which sealed his fate. He left a biological trace, and the staging was just too loud.
And in Fletcher's case, he over-engineered his lie. He focused on the wrong things. He thought that neutralizing the GSR via the shooting range attempt would be enough, but he couldn't control the laws of physics.
Exactly. Dr. Dragovich's analysis of the bullet trajectory proved the physical impossibility of self-harm, and David Woodford's painstaking microscopic examination of the shirt cuff proved his immediate proximity through that high-velocity blood spatter, a truth literally invisible to the naked eye.
What these cases powerfully demonstrate is that the true depth of human deception isn't revealed in grand, obvious contradictions, but in these residual microscopic traces that expose the deliberate manipulation of facts.
The killer can control the stage, but they cannot control the physical realities of the moment of violence. Forensic science offers an impartial, enduring record.
And these deep dives serve as such a powerful reminder that while charisma, charm, and elaborate stories, whether from a calculating serial killer or a sophisticated, ambitious lawyer, can fool a lot of people and complicate investigations, the impartiality of science, focused on fibers, trajectory, and blood aerosol, always provides the final, unassailable answer.
So in a world that's so saturated with carefully constructed narratives, where reputation and personal charm can easily overshadow skepticism, what non-human, impartial evidence do you rely on most in your own life to determine the truth of a difficult or uncertain situation? The evidence is always there. You just need the right lens and the necessary patience to see it clearly.